with a little introduction.
And we're on.
What's up, Gromies? Today we're diving into one of the biggest threats facing our industry, Hop Latent Viroid, and the pathogen crisis that's devastating operations across North America. Today we've got Valin, the lab director from Endless Biotech in Tulsa, who's on the front lines of testing and remediating the infected genetics. Let's talk about the problem and, more importantly, the solutions we've got. Valin, before we get going too far into the science, you want to give us a little brief introduction of who you are and how you got into the position you're in over there at Endless?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just a kid from the Caribbean living his dream. From the Bahamas, born and raised, moved to America for soccer. I played soccer all my life. The right person heard me say soccer, I would get slapped upside my head. But yeah, I grew up playing soccer, was afforded the opportunity to play at the collegiate level, played, junior college, did my JUCO time. Went to a 4-year, which would have been all Roberts University here in Tulsa. Did my bachelor's of global environmental sustainability there. It's a mouthful, of course. And then sort of kind of my focus was soil science. That's what my senior paper was on. That senior paper got me into grad school, dropped out of grad school because I went back to the Bahamas to play for the national team. Had some obviously immigration legal issues there. Those got ironed out while I was home. I ran a soil/compost and mulch facility there, pretty big. I mean, we were pushing out 2 to 3 semi loads of mulch a day, so pretty big for size of the island it was on. So from there, came back to America, worked at and managed a soil company here. That turned into me opening my own company. And that's where I spent a lot of my time within the cannabis space, is the soil science and cultivation side. I learned a lot of the biotech work in college, was afforded the opportunity to sort of kind of brush up on that about 1.5 years ago with my professor from college. He was my genetics professor in college, turned mentor. He brushed up sort of kind of my tissue culture genetics things that I learned in college, and sort of kind of equipped me to then help the cannabis space in terms of, remediating and doing TC in the cannabis space. And that segued into me managing another facility that was sort of kind of within another cultivation facility. And then that went from there to me building a lab. I built a lab for a facility in Colorado Springs, sorry. And then from there, it just kept snowballing and getting bigger and bigger in terms of opportunity size for me. And I think I've found a home in Endless Biotech for sure. I mean, I love it there. The team is amazing. The support from all aspects, from up, down, every breadth and width you can think of the company, the support for what we're trying to do and the goal and the vision is definitely executed very well based on the team that surrounds me.
That's awesome. Answer. It's a pretty cool journey to be in this industry.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of people tell me I need to write a book, but I'm only 30 years old, so we'll save the writing a book for another 8-10 years. Let me sort of kind of experience this for a little bit longer before I sort of kind of start to tell people about my life, if you will. Not, granted, obviously these opportunities I sort of kind of live for a bit more, just because I think the education within the cannabis space is very much so needed. Other verticals within the ag world as well, but people don't necessarily care much. It's very much so kept a secret, I guess you can say, within the other ag verticals. There's other verticals like bananas. People don't even know that the existence of the banana industry is because of TC. We literally would not have had a banana today if it wasn't for TC. And literally all of the plant stock for bananas would have been decimated by fungal contamination if it wasn't for TC.
There, man. It's probably one of my favorite stories to tell people to kind of get them excited about the idea of why genetics is such a fun subject in plants. Looking back at that exact story about the Cavendish banana and where we ended up getting the Cavendish from, and why that was necessary to move towards that genetic lineage versus, I forget what the one we had before the Cavendish was, but I always like to talk to people about that and help them realize that that weird flavoring that we know of as banana and candy actually is modeled after the original flavor of bananas from that original varietal rather than what we see today, which is why there's such a stark contrast in those flavor profiles.
Absolutely. And I see it, obviously I'm from the Bahamas, so like the bananas that we grow locally is not the taste profile, like you said, is like night and day. Like you can go buy a store-bought banana and eat it versus a banana you go pick off the tree. We call them sugar bananas in the Bahamas, and they're nowhere near the size. They're like half the size, damn near, and they are like 3 times the sweetness, literally. And it is that true, like you said, that true banana profile versus the watered down big ag version of what a banana is, if you will.
Yep, and I think it's such a cool story to kind of highlight how important the tissue culture industry has been to being able to both preserve certain genetic lineages in the long term, as well as help us evolve to upcoming and growing threats. I've heard people talk about extinction level events in certain varietals in coffee and chocolate, bananas, of course, that's still going really prevalently these days. As that fungal blight kind of moves its way across Central South
crazy.
America. And so it's a really relevant subject in major ag as well, but I think for a long time it kind of was living in the shadows in the cannabis industry a little bit. So I think it's a fun way to get people to start thinking about the ways that tissue culture has affected other types of crops and kind of give them an inkling into what we can hopefully bring to the table in cannabis with it.
Yeah, it's similar across other things within the space as well. I mean, you think of things like tetraploids, for example. Like, what do you think a seedless watermelon is? What do you think any seedless fruit is? It's the same exact thing. It's literally the exact same thing. We're sort of kind of, and I think the education side of it, it's sad, but at the same time, it's the reality of like, I mean, really and truly, if you sort of kind of, and again, it just goes back to being a rabbit hole, like people think that you mentioned tissue culture to certain people within the space and they're like, oh, GMO cannabis. And it's just like, no, like GMO is not like, no, like TC is not, we're not modifying anything genetically. We're just giving the plant a sterile environment to grow and give us fresh, clean tissue, if you will. And obviously on the extreme end of the spectrum is, going the meristematic route and sort of kind of resetting that gene code, not resetting it, but allowing the plant to express that gene code as a whole versus any epigenetic change or genetic drift that potentially could have happened through traditional cloning. And then obviously the albeit, which is the HLVd remediation or any pathogen or fungal, endophytic bacteria or fungal life that may be pressing the plant, being able to hit that reset button and sort of kind of take the plant back to square one, if you will. So that's, I think that's the bigger part, is that education, that there's not very many people that, one, are willing to educate, because again, the TC world has been such a gate-kept world. So you're putting a gate-kept world in the TC world and putting it in a gate-kept industry like the cannabis industry. It's like you're literally trying to make two negatives sort of kind of like they're going to repel automatically. There's always going to be resistance. It's always like, what are you trying to do to my weed? It's like, I'm trying 100%. To help, if you will. I imagine if we had the same pushback with bananas, where would we be? I would be pissed because I love bananas. That's literally my favorite fruit. Like literally, I would be livid if this was the case with bananas.
Well,
so it's
and like, can you imagine the same pushback with coffee? You know, like as we start to
Right.
see the major coffee varietals start to phase out of being able to be commercially viable, do you think people are going to turn away and turn the other cheek from tissue culture? I don't think so. I think they're going to be trying and already are in many places to produce
trying everything. You want to try everything, you know, and like genetic preservation and that's obviously a bigger part to it, you know. It's like we don't want to lose, you know, and again, here comes, like you mentioned, the commercialization of everything is also a possibility of as well. You know, you have to, I think it's just a very, and that's with anything, you know, with science, there's a very fine line, in my opinion. And anything that I say is strictly based on opinion and based on the knowledge that I have. You know, I'm not going to ever speak on something that I don't know, you know, well versed on, if you will, for lack of better words. So, I mean, I really think that it's a fine line that needs to be tread or trotted, and it needs to be explored. You know, I mean, I see anomalies happen all the time in the lab, you know, with cultivars that are in vitro. You know, you see that from this recipe that's got this cultivar doing great, and then this cultivar is falling flat on its face. And, you know, like that's where media understanding all the things that come into play when executing, you know, the practice, if you will, of TC, it needs to be taken into account. You know, there's no one size fit all. There's a one size that fits majority, but if you're talking about a one size fit all, it just doesn't work. It literally does not work, no matter how you put it. I mean, I like to use the analogy of when you're in the ICU on a drip. You know, like that's literally what we're doing is doing anything that we're doing with the plant intravenously. That's the whole, you know, in vitro. That's all in vitro means, is intravenously. Likewise, you being in the hospital, being on a drip, getting medication straight into your bloodstream rather than the doctor giving you a tablet and allowing your body to digest everything and sort of kind of get into your bloodstream and then work. So, you know, it's just, I think it's an education thing. It's a 1000% an education thing, in my opinion.
I think that's one thing we really love doing, is helping bring that that open, non-gate kept education to the cannabis community. I think it's really exciting to see too, because it's you know, years ago I remember reading about tissue culture projects in more major you know, other verticals in ag, and thinking, well, why isn't this becoming more practiced throughout the cannabis industry? And I remember talking to a friend of mine at the time that was like, no, it just doesn't really have all that much place in our industry. It's never going to catch on. It's not necessary. It's not useful. And, you know, one of the interesting things that I think has kind of pushed it into more of the mainstream is how prolific the Hop Latent Viroid has become throughout a lot of different species in the cannabis, or not species, but varietals in the cannabis industry. And I think that that's sort of pushed people to start to really look down that rabbit hole and try to understand some of the dense material that's out there. But I think that's partially to, you know, your guys' benefit, seeing people start to look at these as real solutions that they can use to be able to achieve good results and to clean up genetics, maintain clean genetics. So it's really exciting to see. I want to take the opportunity to steer us a little bit more into what you're seeing in the lab, because you touched on it a little bit, but you know, I'm hearing numbers all over the place from people that, you know, whole facilities losing several sections of varietals to Hop Latent, and wondering what the prevalence of that versus other types of pathogens that you guys are testing for is right now.
I'm a bad guy. I'll be completely honest. In the TC world, like HLVd is that, from my perspective as a lab director, I honestly, first of all, nothing gets into my lab if it's not tested. So having that issue within my lab is automatically stomped out from the gate. Like I don't push anything into multiplication until I know that my starting material that's in initiation tests and checks out clean. Now, if it doesn't test out as clean, then that whole initiation phase is scrapped. I go back to rudimentary and I pull Meristems, pull your apical meristem out, extract your totipotent cells or your bundle of cells, and then go ahead and go back to square one, basically. But I mean, for me, the bigger bad guys is endophytic bacteria and fungi. People don't understand how complex cannabis truly is as a plant. Forget that it produces medicine. Forget that it produces whatever it produces, fiber, whatever, however you want to use it. Forget that for a second. Look at it solely as a plant. It is one of the most complex plants on earth, period. That's why it's so hard, and people don't like to sort of kind of explore it because it's so hard. Like, let's take, for example, if we're talking date palms, for example, you have a recipe that's used very commonly among all species of date palm, or likewise with bananas. They all sort of kind of fall into that same one-size-fit-all category. With cannabis, it's like every cultivar is its own being, if you will. You know, they may not necessarily like the media or things of that nature. And then also it brings, like I mentioned, the bad guys. You know, they have so much more places to hide in cannabis. Like most contamination, the sucky part, in my opinion, with contamination within cannabis is all the places that it has to hide. The contamination is never usually a systemic contamination. It's usually an isolated contamination per nodes even. Like, I mean, sometimes I initiate, let's just say I initiated 2 flats of nodes from random strain, let's say toffee heads, right? I can have 50 nodes. Well, sorry, not 50, because flats only hold 24. So I can have 48 nodes, and not all of those nodes are going to be contaminated or potentially contaminated with an endophytic fungi or bacteria. You know, you'll have maybe, you know, anywhere from, depending on the cultivar, you know, you could have a cultivar, and this is very much so where people overlook the upstream, downstream effect of keeping cultivars clean. You know, so I'll give you an example of what could potentially happen. If you have a mother plant that's in your mother space nursery, wherever you keep your mother plants, let's just say there's some fungal life floating around in the air. There's spores floating around in the air. You don't have an air purifier, but they're not in your plant just yet. You go and break a leaf off, or you scar the tissue on a leaf or the stem, wherever you decide to scar that tissue, and that spore lands on that scarred tissue, that's now going to be in the plant. Those spores find a home within the plant. So now you have a possible systemic, because they're going to travel within the system of the plant, and then they'll sort of kind of lodge themselves and stay dormant. So there's also, you know, it becomes a rabbit hole, because you have dormant contamination and you have, or what is called active versus latent. You know, we'll have the active ones we can deal with surface sterilization, but the latent ones, we sort of kind of don't know until they sort of kind of expose themselves, if you will, or they express themselves. So that's, you know, sort of the downstream, upstream effect of why it's important to start clean, so that when it gets to the lab, it's clean. And that sort of kind of segues into, you know, the role that Aroya plays within our facility is, you know, I don't use Aroya directly within the lab, but I am directly affected by the cause and effect of using Aroya within the cultivation space. That allows us to keep moms healthy, drybacks, so that there's not excess water within the media, to allow these fungal lives or bacterial colonies to thrive, and then allow the plant to have access to sort of kind of take them up. You know, and people also, in my opinion, don't realize that, hey, cannabis is literally, in nature, it's a bioremediator. So what it's going to do is literally take up anything that's in the media. It's not able to decipher, hey, that's a fungus, I don't want to take that up. Or, you know, it's too much, let's just say too much nitrogen. It's not going to be able to regulate and say, hey, I don't need any more nitrogen, so I'm not going to take it up. Hence why you have deficiencies and excesses in cannabis. You know, in most plants you do, but in cannabis it's even more amplified, because as a plant, it's known and it is structured to be a bioremediator. So naturally, it's going to go ahead and take up anything that's present. So that's why it's so important to incorporate things like Aroya sensors or any set type of sensor to be able to manage and steer that plant to not be susceptible to detrimental effects, if you will.
Absolutely.
Interesting conversation. I'm hoping maybe you can tell me a little bit about what you're doing in the lab. As far as, are you mostly based on production? Are you a production laboratory, so you're trying for endless crop, or are you guys also doing research, trying to figure out what
So
endosymbionts
I
are
mean,
most effective?
science doesn't stop at the end of the day. If you stop, then you're not doing science. There's questions to be asked every single day. But yes, we are doing R&D is constant in a TC lab because you constantly have to be monitoring variables of cultivars in culture. One day they can be fine. Like, I mean, I had a vessel that was clean yesterday and we came in this morning and there was contamination, literally within 24 hours. So it's a constant R&D of like, okay, well now, why did that plant material where did that contamination come from? Why? Because it's localized. It's a contamination that's going to be localized. And the minute you make a cut and you stick that now allows that contamination to have access to food and whatever else is within the media, hence why it expresses itself. Now, in regards to R&D, we're working on polonias, which is a very, it's a soft hardwood. We're working on sort of kind of some reforestation projects along with that. We're working on, obviously, cannabis. Like you mentioned, it's a production-based thing with cannabis for us. We're not doing any quote-unquote remediation right now. We're going to sort of kind of be taking on clients to be able to offer that service to other people. But obviously, we want to make sure we take care of ourselves first. You can't put your oxygen mask on someone else before you put it on yourself. So we're trying to make sure that we're sort of kind of locking in those processes and making sure that we can ramp up production on our end. And once we do that, then we can go ahead and then offer that service to others as well. So with the R&D side of things, I'm constantly researching and doing R&D on media, what works, what doesn't work. Metatoplin may be a good hormone for a signaling hormone for this cultivar, but it may hate BAP. So the R&D literally does not stop. We're also looking to get into other verticals. I mentioned date palms earlier. So date palms is another one that we're going to start doing some R&D on as well. So date palms, bananas ultimately is where we want to reach into as well. That's one of the verticals I know we want to reach into. Those are the next three verticals that we're going to tap into is polonias, bananas, and date palms in no specific order for sure. But there's, again, like you mentioned, you asked, like, is there R&D? Yes, I can sit here and name 5 different research projects that we're working on right now, and there's probably way more than that. So again, that doesn't stop. If it does stop, then you're not doing science anymore. You're sort of kind of going into that remedial, mundane task, if you will. So yes, it doesn't stop. My brain also doesn't stop as well. Like, I mean, I have an issue. I have a very Google Scholar probably hates to see me come in, really and truly. Literally,
you're in good company there, my friend.
Yeah, no, and it's funny because people don't use Google Scholar, and it is the most important tool to me as a scientist. Like, you've got other things like ChatGPT, but you also cross-reference anything that ChatGPT says with Google Scholar because that's going to be published, proven science. There's no bro science involved. I mean, funny enough, there's a decent amount of science published research on cannabis. I mean, there's University of Mississippi, for example, I know I've read probably 3 or 4 papers in regards to one topic in regards to cannabis and hormones. And like, there's an R&D experiment I'm doing right now is the true effectiveness of activated charcoal within the media. Does it even make sense? Activated charcoal is easily the most expensive ingredient if you had to put it pound for pound in the lab sense, gram for gram, cost per gram. It is the most expensive input. And so I'm sort of kind of seeing like, is it needed? Is it truly going to make a difference? In my opinion, if the growth rates are similar and the plant reaction is similar with and without activated charcoal, then what's the point? It's kind of like, in typical growing, like people, and I'm going to argue this till the death of me, like, do microbes really matter? 1000% they do. Like literally, there's growing, in my opinion, growing in a sterile environment is great. And this sounds weird coming from me, seeing that I do TC and I sort of kind of push growing in a sterile environment. But in reality, like, microbes is the bane of existence of any organism, whether it be you and me or it be plants. And that's really another rabbit hole. That's literally another episode rabbit hole type of thing. So it's just one of those things where I think people just have to sort of kind of get away from the bro science, and sort of kind of not rely on anecdotal evidence and rely on science, true based evidence. And with all the R&D that we're doing, we're going to be releasing true white papers, published research to prove these claims. Like, yeah, I can write down these experiments and I can do the experiment and get the data, but that data doesn't do me any good. I mean, it does me good within our vertical, yes, but what is that going to do for the world? What does that do for another facility? That's where I think we have to get over this hump of, I did the research, I got the knowledge, I'm going to keep it until I see fit to share that with the world. Like, that's not how science works. Like, if that's how science works, we would all be dead. Literally, all the research being done on the medical side of things, that's the reason why medicine has exponentially taken leaps and bounds, because you've got scientists in Australia doing research and sharing it with scientists in America. Here's what we found with malaria, how it reacted in our environment. Okay, how did it react in your environment? So being able to share that data in a comfortable space, if you will, I think we have to, as a community, cultivate that space and allow that space to sort of kind of be, and not create. And obviously, likewise, that you guys do with, office hours, and, there's countless podcasts out there, but I think there needs to be a more heavy focus on what the true science is behind it, taking into account, all the variables. I can literally name more than on two hands the amount of variables that people don't take into account when they're also doing that. You ask some people like, okay, well, you tried it. Yeah, I tried it. Oh, well, here's what happened. And then you go into asking variables, and it's just like, where's the scientific method? The scientific method is a scientific method for a reason. The scientific method don't change. Whether you're doing science or research on plants or living organisms, whether it's rats or humans or whatever it is, the scientific method does not change. That's why they teach you that in high school. You learn the scientific method in high school. From fundamental foundational science is based on a scientific method for a reason. You have a control and you have experiment for a reason. Well, what was your control? Is my first question usually. And they're like, what? And I'm like, okay, then now your research is sort of kind of negated. All of this resources that you've spent, the money you spent on electric, light, nutrients, all these things is sort of kind of negated because you had no control. There was no control. What did you compare it to? Oh, last cycle I had a plant that did it. And I'm like, well, yes, I understand that you can say that, but the variables last cycle may have changed. The environmental variables, were they exactly the same? How did you control them to make sure that they stayed exactly the same? Okay, well, you did, but where's the data? Like, again, Aroya, and I kid you not, they did not pay me to say it. Aroya didn't pay me to say any of this, but that's just the reality of it. You guys are able to give cultivation facilities that data and provide them with the tools to receive that data and digest that data to make informed decisions. Because if you're not making a decision based on data, then you're just wishing on a star, in my opinion. And that's just, again, the scientific or science side of things of like, you can't make an informed decision. You can make a hypothesis, which is an intelligent guess, but that's all it is, an intelligent guess, until you truly back that. Hence why I published and research and all of this is an actual, that's why we got Google Scholar versus Google. Literally. I mean, that's just the difference, and that's the reality of the difference.
I love that. I really appreciate the affinity for Google Scholar. Definitely one of my most visited sections of websites.
Yeah, no, it's always on my tab for sure.
So take us through a little bit of kind of what it looks like walking into a day in Endless. I know, there's the side that you majoritively work on in the lab, and then you guys also do production with not only flower in the facility, but also with genetics as well. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. So and I can obviously, again, I can only speak to my day to day. But I come in and I come in before the team. So I try to be there at least 20 minutes before the team gets there. Ideally, I want to be there an hour before, just to sort of kind of get myself grounded, run through the racks, see if there's any contamination. Like most times I see contamination before the team does, because obviously I'm there before them. So that's really what it looks like, just like it is in the garden. The first thing you do when you go to the garden is scout, right? Because if I need to spray that day, or if I was going to spray that day and pressure is non-existent and it's just a maintenance, that tells me what I need to be applying, how much, all of that. So that's sort of kind of where my day starts is getting scrubbed down, get into the lab, walk through, check on all the R&D that we're doing, making sure that they're going the way they should. One of my most sort of kind of groundbreaking things that we're doing is using the biotilt from Plant Cell Technology, which is just a form of a bioreactor. It's a semi-immersion bioreactor is what it's really the sciencey name of it. But it's literally just 2 mason jars that are literally flipped to immerse the plant material into a nutrient-rich liquid, and then it flips it back the other way. So it's basically a whole tilt. It literally just does this and goes back. So that's sort of kind of what I do first thing, and then obviously we have our breakout. We have our meeting every day, every morning. We have a breakout, daily plan, weekly plan. Obviously questions, comments, concerns from the team. And then that obviously segues into me breaking off into our lead breakout that we have every day, staying abreast on what's going on around the facility. And then obviously sharing, every lead has their sort of kind of, you share what you're doing for the day, if you will. If you need help within that department, and we have floaters that can help in various departments and things of that nature. Not so much floaters don't help us in the lab. My core team is my core team. And then, my day-to-day right now, my day-to-days are sort of kind of going to be mundane for the next few weeks, because I'm working on getting Meristems extracted from all of the cultivars we have in-house, getting them all into vessels, and sort of kind of hitting the reset button on everything from ground zero. Is what I'm working on now. I'm going to be working on that for probably 4 weeks, really and truly. We've got a lot of cultivars, and obviously Meristem extraction takes me roughly 15 minutes to extract a Meristem, and that is a very tedious task. I don't love doing it at all. I'll be completely honest. It's not something I love to do, but that's the part of the process that has to happen. I love the process, but I hate the extraction of a Meristem. I love seeing, the tip of a 25 gauge needle, a little bundle of cells coming from the tip of a 25 gauge needle to growing a plant. Like, that is beautiful, mind-blowing in my mind as a scientist. I've done it time and time again, and it still blows my mind every single time.
That brings up an interesting point I wanted to get into, actually. A lot of cultivators out there these days are starting to use tissue culture to both preserve their genetics and then get their genetics from a lab. I see people from time to time have a hard time getting their their plant material acclimated, situated, and then broken apart into their individual clones as they start to grow. I would imagine being at Endless, you've seen your fair share of how to acclimatize your cultures into actual rooted shoots. Could you speak to some of the most common pitfalls you see happen with that?
Common one is contamination. Endophytic fungal and bacteria pressure is that's the biggest something that people never get over, or sometimes they do get over and they only got one explant at the end of it. And that's the one hero essentially that you sort of kind of got to push through and nurse. But I think honestly where a lot of people fall short when doing TC is aseptic technique. Yes, plant tissue is a very important variable, but if you're not doing the right things to ensure that that plant tissue is getting into the vessel in an aseptic manner, it don't matter how clean that plant material is. All it takes is one slip up in your aseptic technique to cause that harm, if you will. When I say aseptic technique, it just refers to staying clean. When you're in the hood, you're not waving your arms around and, because we have skin cells that literally rub off on us, so like, for me, it's like when I'm in the hood, like that's something we're dealing with right now is working on getting coats for everybody. People look at a white coat and they're like, oh, that's for the doctors and the scientists. And I'm like, no, that's not. A lab coat is to increase aseptic technique. Like, yes, it's sort of kind of founded on the premise of doctors wear white coats, but it's more than that. They wear white coats. Why? So that they don't contaminate you with something they were dealing with another patient. So it's likewise in the TC world. I think that's where the biggest pitfall is for people is executing that aseptic technique. And if you're not taught that, it's not easy to learn because naturally we're gross as humans. We're not clean. We're not aseptic by no means. We have dead skin cells that fall off of us. I mean, they're falling off of me right now. So like we're not clean individuals or clean organisms, if you will, for lack of better words. So I think the aseptic technique is where a lot of people fall short. And then that segues into what I think is the second most important is starting with clean material. Why I put that second is because you're going to be in positions where the material isn't clean and you have to go the Meristem route and extract that Meristem. But if you don't do that in an aseptic manner, then it doesn't matter at the end of the day. That Meristem can then be contaminated because of a surface contamination, not because of the contamination isn't going to become endophytic because those cells aren't going to hold endophytic or fungal or bacterial life. So I think for me, the biggest thing is aseptic technique, like hands down. And I mean, that's where, in my opinion, people are like, oh, well, I can get a flow hood and put it in my garage or in my bathroom or, but yes, you can. I'm not saying that's impossible to execute aseptic technique that way. But what happens when you cut that flow hood off?
Yep.
Who's going to keep a flow hood running 24/7? If you're not a lab like us, like our flow hoods don't cut off for that very reason. If I turn the flow hood off, now my tech has to go ahead and scrub literally the entire hood. Now our lab is positively pressured and as clean as can be, but it only takes one spore. It only takes one tiny microorganism that you cannot see to ravage an entire load of hard work essentially that you've done. So like specifically in our lab, I don't turn hoods off at all. And obviously people are going to argue, oh, you're wasting electricity. Well, you would rather me do that, or you would rather me turn it off and potentially have opportunity for contamination to creep in, and that's why I sort of kind of don't agree with the whole, let me see how to put this without sounding rude, if you will, but like, I just don't agree with the, and I don't want to use redneck because that's not a politically correct term, but like you don't want to redneck a situation when it comes to things like this, because you're dealing with the lifeline of your operation. Literally, it only takes, like I said, one contamination event to happen to eliminate an entire stock of plants, and that goes back to the storage thing, like you mentioned. People don't get that, keeping plants in culture for a long time is not beneficial. Like, that's not in my opinion, the proper way to store, because if you're exposing a plant to hormones for 365 days a year and their internal engine of hormone signaling isn't allowed to express itself, the plant forgets that it's a plant. It's very similar to being in the ICU for 3-4 weeks, months on a machine. Your body is going to start to deteriorate because it doesn't know what it means to stand on its own 2 feet. So likewise with plants, there is a sort of kind of a cycle count that you sort of kind of, obviously you have to have the trained eye as well to realize, like, hey, this cultivar is starting to act weird. Why? Because we're literally telling it what to do based on giving it hormones. So there is going to be a point in time where you're going to have to root them, take them out of culture, reinitiate, and go back around the wheel again. Unless you're doing genetic storage via cryo, which is something that we're going to get into real soon. I'm not going to sort of kind of put a date on it, but we're diving into that as well, of cryo storage of that's the ultimate way to store genetics in mammalian culture or plant culture. That's the albeit of storing in cryo. So there's a big learning curve, obviously, but I think, back to your question, I think aseptic technique 100% is where the pitfall is for most people.
I mean, I would say that's one of the biggest issues people tend to have, whether it's lab setting in cannabis or whether it's in just general cultivation.
Traditional cultivation. Absolutely.
Cleanliness tends to be one of those pitfalls that if you skip or skimp in any way,
I'll clean it up tomorrow.
Yep.
I'll vacuum that runoff tomorrow. Or, that literally is, like you mentioned, that's sort of kind of, and I'm a attention to detail kind of person, so like cleanliness is, and I'm obviously not spewing God, but cleanliness is next to godliness. That's just sort of kind of how I live, like if you can sort of kind of shortcut that, then, I mean, I got some questions about, what does your home look like? Like all of that is attention to detail. That's literally all it comes down to. And that's what's, in my opinion, that's what separates the facilities that are able to go to the next level versus the ones that stay. And I'm not saying craft is bad. Like, I prefer craft. I would go to a craft brewery before I go buy a Budweiser off the shelf. That's just the reality of it, because I appreciate the craft that goes into that beer. The taste of it is, it's not, they didn't make 1 million bottles of this. The quality is, it brings that artisan side of it, and going to the Napa Valley, like you want to taste wine, then go there. Don't go and buy a bottle of wine off the shelf if you truly want to appreciate wine. So yeah, I definitely agree with you on that.
So I have to ask. Obviously, you've got a background in soil sciences, and when you talk about craft of different types, what's your favorite media to grow in a personal setting or a professional setting?
Personal and professional, I'm always going to say living soil, because I own a soil company. I produce living soil, so I'm always going to say that. But it is here's where that argument gets real dicey. And again, I don't knock Rockwool or cocoa or any of that. There's 1 million ways to skin a cat. Reality, right? So for me, it's very facility and very situational. You can't scale organics, and people are going to say this and people are going to disagree, but scaling organics is 10 million times harder than scaling synthetics. Why?
Especially trying to do it clean.
Yeah, doing it clean. You have to know your inputs. That's a big thing with organics. With organics, there's no reset button that you can do. Like, the minute you put that into your media, you could forget about it. It's in there. The only way, if it's an uh-oh or an sort of kind of oh shit moment, you can't just pull a Rockwell cube out and replace it when you're dealing with organics. You know, so you have to be a lot more diligent on what you're putting in. And if you don't have an individual at the helm of the facility that is eyes on that stuff all the time, knowing what's going in, testing and knowing what needs to go in, that's where it gets real hard to scale organics, because it's hard to find somebody that has done organics, one, doing organics in your house. I don't care if you've got 10 lights, 20 lights, versus scaling that to 100 lights. It is a completely different beast, like 1000%. You know, media is not soil, living soil specifically. You know, when you're talking about I've ran 30-foot long beds and I've grown in a 4x4 foot bed. It is a different beast altogether. And I'm saying that as a soil scientist, because there's so many variables that you have to sort of kind of be able to control. So again, yes, organics can be scaled 1000%. But if you don't have an individual that knows what they're doing within organics, and knowing what you're doing within organics is simply just knowing the organic system, knowing that, the plant exudes or exudates that microbes then eat, and then they sort of kind of synthesize that exudate, and then they know what to go and farm to give the plant. People don't even understand that that's a whole process within, from nutrient to plant roots. There's a whole process in between here that people don't even know exists. So being able to understand all of that process, which is very complex, I'm not saying that I know it through and through. There are instances where I have customers that I consult with, and I'm like, bro, I don't know what the hell you did. Like, I need you to be transparent. And then here comes people, they're sort of kind of embarrassed to say like, hey, I did put too much gypsum, or I didn't scoop and put exactly 1 cup. I did 1.25 cups. Like, that little quarter makes a huge difference. Like, when building soil, I've seen literally 1/4 of a spoon of a spoon make a difference in a media with heavy metal expression, like literally. So it's like understanding and knowing that attention to detail matters a lot more. Now, scaling synthetics is different. It's easy, and it's still not easy. It's still hard when scaling, but imagine scaling something that has a much more complex system like organics does. So like, again, people take that argument and run with it, in my opinion, in a way or down an avenue of segregation. Like, that's what I hate about the argument. I'm always open to having that conversation with anybody. Like, if it doesn't work for your facility, that's okay. Like, for example, for Endless, like, we have a team of people that do their jobs when I say very, I mean exceptionally well, i.e. why the facility is as beautiful and as clean as it is. Now let's go throw soil in there now. You now have to teach everybody, both from the tech level to the director level, what that organic system is. Because the reality of it, if you have a facility with however many hundreds of lights, that director is not going to be able to walk through that entire facility and know.
So,
go ahead.
I just wanted to throw in, like, given the complexities we're talking about with organic growing that you're not seeing necessarily with synthetic growing, what's your opinion on the trend these days of organic growing, or the supplementation of organic into an otherwise synthetic feeding approach?
I'm here for it. I mean, anything that brings in microbes into the situation. Like, I look at nutrient programs all the time. I mean, you can name any nutrient program and literally just look at the bottle, read the bottle. It's kind of like when you're buying food, read the bottle. Like, there are going to be missing pieces, and in most cases, the missing piece is microbes. You're sort of kind of expecting the plant to break down these nutrients and absorb these nutrients. If they're not chelated properly, you're sort of kind of just pouring money down the drain, essentially. So if you don't have anything that can chelate those nutrients to make them more plant available, yes, you can argue the point that they are in an aqueous solution, so they should be plant available. But the plants also, you got to remember, they're used to communicating with a microbiome, and then that also, it's again an upstream downstream effect. There comes, you're now dealing with plant immunity that's going to be compromised, because them having a microbiome assists their immunity to PM and all of these things. So you're going to have that issue as well. That's going to be another downstream issue that you're going to have within a synthetic facility. And I can guarantee you, if you speak to anybody that had synganics or tried the synganic approach, they've seen a lot less pressure on the IPM side or the PM side, or whichever. With any abiotic stressor with the plants, they've seen an increase in plant immunity, hands down, because again, it's like us as humans. Like if you were to take a vaccine, it's literally just giving you the antibodies of the said disease or anything of that nature to allow your body to adapt when they do see the disease. It's not making you invisible, like by no means, but it's allowing your body to be able to digest and sort of kind of facilitate growing and actually being in light or under pressure of said disease. And it translates directly to plants. If you have plants that don't know what it is to defend itself against powdery mildew spores, then how do you expect them to fight off these powdery mildew spores? And you'll see it within cultivars as well. You'll have cultivars that are more susceptible to PM versus not. That goes back to the plant's immunity, and that immunity goes down with genetic drift, with the age of the mom. Your starting material matters more than people think. And going back to what we spoke about earlier, people have to understand how plants actually work. Yes, you can keep this cut as fresh and healthy as possible over 20 years. Oh, I've been running the same cut for 20 years. I can guarantee you, if you do gene sequencing on when you first did that plant to what it looks like now, that gene sequence does not look exactly the same. And that's
we could have a whole conversation on epigenetic drift.
Yeah. That's literally what, and people don't get it until it gets too, like, it goes back to, like, they don't care until it harms them, until they're seeing the effects of it, essentially, which goes back to what you were saying earlier with HLVd, like, people sort of kind of like, oh, I don't have it, so it ain't something that I got to worry about. But then you do get it, and you're like, oh shit, I got it now. What do I do? And then it's like, it's too late at that point. It's there. So now you got to scrap the whole facility essentially and go back to ground zero. And I'm talking about, like, when I say ground zero, HLVd can live on plant tissue matter for years and years. If you've got plant matter that got into your dehumidifier filter and you didn't change your filter, that HLVd can be there. And then if it pops off of that filter and touches the plant, it's now reintroduced. Dust that settles on the top of your table or on the top of a light or all of that. It's HLVd is a virus. I like to refer to viruses as a pirate. It only needs a host. So if it has plant matter that it can be sort of kind of a pirate on, it's going to sit there and just survive. It doesn't need to have a living organism. It just needs host material to live on and a living cell to hijack. So, it's sort of kind of understanding the whole gamut of where and how it sort of kind of happens. You can't troubleshoot a problem if you don't know all the variables at the end of the day.
100%.
So it literally goes back to what you were saying of HLVd, of understanding where it came from. Obviously, it came from the hops industry. Somehow it managed to jump to us. The exact origin of it, I don't know, and we'll never know. We can make assumptions, but we'll never know. Now it is a problem. How do we solve the problem? How do we put our brains together to solve the problem? Having that conversation, it's kind of like people don't want to have that conversation because they feel like they're going to be judged. Like, oh, well, you got HLVd. Well, your facility must be filthy. Not really. That's not necessarily what it comes down to. It could have been somebody came into the facility that had plant material on their hands, or, so like taking that precautionary measure. I don't know if you guys have been to our facility. So, that's why the importance of scrubbing down and putting visitors in lab coats and putting hairnets on and make sure they have gloves on, make sure they have masks on. If they've got a beard, they're putting on their net. Things of that nature are very, very important and can't be overlooked because it only takes one. It literally only takes one for it to be a big issue, if you will.
A great segue into my last question for you, which is about the robots.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing with that here to kind of close us out for the day?
Yeah, so I don't like to talk about robots because people think I'm trying to take jobs away from humans. That's not what it is. We're not trying to take away jobs from humans. We're literally trying to allow humans to continue to do what humans do and innovate. Robots aren't going to innovate. Robots are going to do what you tell them to do at the end of the day. So like if you're in fear for your job because of a robot or because of AI, you've got some things to look into yourself about. I mean, that's the reality of it. There's a human element that cannot be replaced. Robots don't ask questions. They're going to do their task no matter what. So what we're using them to do now is sort of kind of scale the tissue culture side of things, the mundane task of making media, pouring media. That's something that I don't want to have a tech have to do. That's not fun. That gets old real quick. You're measuring the same thing down to the 0.1 of a gram every single day, so that gets mundane. So we're working on that. We're working on also getting the robot to cut and stick plants. And we started last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, when I was on, we were talking about it with the team at Standard Bots, is using robots to sort of kind of scale that actual traditional cloning side of things, like they could be used in that light as well. But for us, we're just using it more so to focus on the TC side of things and scale the TC, the mundane task of chopping explants, the robot learning where a node is, where I need to cut, how I need to stick this into the vessel or things of that nature. But that's what we're doing with the robot now. Let me see how to put this. I'm not worried on where robots go. Like I'll be blatantly honest with that. Like, I mean, I'm very secure in what I know and very secure on my pursuit for knowledge. So like me, for example, that's partially why I read white papers every day, or I try to. It's because like a core value of mine is learn something new every day. Haphazardly we do. And I wish that was a joke, but you do learn something new every day. But if I mentally can sit down at the end of the day and say, oh, I can't pinpoint something I learned today, then I'm going to go ahead and read a white paper. And then that's where I go down my rabbit hole of reading multiple ones before bed. And then my wife is pissed at me because I'm laying down in bed on my phone reading a white paper. It's just like, that's just my science, my obsessive science brain sort of kind of taking over, if you will. But yeah, robots, it's inevitable, really and truly. I mean, our cars are made by robots now. Car factories used to be hands, and obviously there are some that still do it, like Ferrari and all these craft. Ferrari is just a craft company. They're making craft cars, not mass production cars. So it's nothing.
There'll still be a place for the hands.
Right. You cannot get rid of the human element. The human element is always going to be there. Granted, again, tools like Aroya and things of that nature are tools. That's all a robot is. It's a tool. It's not the engine, if you will. It's not, someone has to service a robot, right? A robot can't service itself. I don't know if you've ever seen.
I watched you guys when I was there training the robots. And I mean, even just getting the robots to be able to perform the tasks that you are, it looks like it's taking, an immense amount of time and training and concentration, learning the robots and the systems. It's fascinating.
Absolutely.
Well, I would love to keep running down because I think this conversation could easily go on for another hour or two, but
we can circle
I know we're up against
time.
Exactly. I know we're up against some time limits, so I got to close this out. To everyone watching today, this has been an awesome episode. I hope you guys learned as much as I did from Valin here. Valon's been incredibly eye-opening. The combination of talking about your tissue culture practices, the whys and hows, and understanding the importance of it and what it can do for not only cannabis but other types of crops is fascinating to listen to. Gromies, if you want to learn a little bit more about Endless Biotech's tissue culture services or pathogen testing, just follow along and shoot us a question, or you can also look up Endless Biotech's website. Sorry, I lost my place there, but man, this has just been a lot of fun. It's a really interesting conversation. It's not every day we get to talk to someone like yourself with such a vast and yet really specific collection of knowledge around this type of a subject. So it's been awesome just listening to you and learning from you.
An absolute pleasure, man. And I am all ears to any questions that people may have. I mean, literally reach out to me, and there's no question that goes unanswered. Obviously, if I have thousands of DMs, it'll take a while to get through, or messages or emails, whatever it may be. But I'm not that famous yet. So I answer everything. I try to answer everything. And I'll be blatantly honest with you. If I don't know, I will tell you. I do not know. Let's find out together. I
appreciate that.
Exponential resources.
One of my favorite things for people to say is, I don't know, because at least they're willing to tell me they don't know instead of telling you something else.
No, don't sit here and tell me something you don't know. You see what I'm saying? Because now that creates a false perception within my brain.
100%.
And as I mentioned, I have resources. I mean, my mentor is literally a cancer researcher, So if I don't know, most likely he's got the answer. I don't think I've ever went to him with something and he was like, well, I don't know. Let's find out together. He's a microbiologist. So it gives for good reads and good conversations, if you will. So again, I'm ready to circle the block and revisit whenever you guys are ready. And let's continue to help educate people and educate our sector, if you will.
That sounds fantastic, Valin.
All righty. Well, have a great day, guys. And thank you for tuning in.
Absolutely. Gromies, that's going to wrap up this episode of Aroya Office Hours. If you found this podcast valuable or interesting, make sure you subscribe wherever you're getting your podcast, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or Amazon Music. Drop your questions in the comments and hit us up on Instagram, aroya.io. We read every comment and we try to get any people who are asking questions a spot on our live shows where we do our live Q&A. So feel free to drop those questions in there. If you're looking to level up on your cultivation game, check out Aroya.io to see how our sensors and software can help you dial in your operations like Endless here. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, keep steering those crops, and try not to gatekeep the knowledge. Appreciate it, everybody.
Absolutely. Sweet. I think that went well, right?